Single mom spills coffee on a millionaire CEO, and it changes her life forever. Before the story begins, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And when it's over, don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Grace Mitchell was about to become another coffee-related accident statistic when her life changed forever. Not that she knew it at the time. All she knew was that she had exactly 17 minutes to get to Widener Library, return 3 overdue books, grab 4 more for her economic history paper, rush to Professor Morrison's class, a man with all the warmth of a constipated penguin, and still make it to Emma's daycare before 6. Oh, and she couldn't forget the coffee. Never forget the coffee. With a worn-out backpack slung over her left shoulder, a stack of books defying the laws of physics balanced on her right arm, and an extra-large coffee from Harvard Square Cafe in her left hand, Grace moved through the marble halls like a tightrope walker trying to cross during an earthquake. "Come on, Grace, you've got this," she muttered to herself, dodging a cluster of freshmen blocking the hallway like a confused herd of sheep. Just one more semester, just a few more bills, just a few more. That's when she saw him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. Hair perfectly styled. Posture screaming, "I run boardrooms for breakfast." He was standing right in front of the library's revolving doors, checking something on his phone with the focus of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Grace tried to stop, but physics wasn't on her side. Between the speed she'd picked up coming down the stairs and the law of inertia, which she knew all too well thanks to her physics electives, she was on a direct collision course. "Excuse me," she yelled in a last-minute attempt to warn him. He looked up from his phone exactly as Grace performed what could have been an impressive move, if it had been intentional. A clumsy ballerina-style spin to avoid him while somehow keeping all her belongings in place. It almost worked. Almost. The coffee, blessed be, stayed in the cup, the book stayed in her arms. The backpack stayed on her shoulder. Grace stayed standing. What didn't stay intact was his dignity. A single drop of coffee had escaped during her evasive maneuver and landed, with surgical precision, right in the center of his silk tie. A tie that Grace realized with growing horror probably cost more than her used laptop. For a moment, the world stopped. The steady flow of students around them kept moving. But in that tiny space between Grace and the perfectly dressed stranger, time froze. He looked down, then up, then at Grace, then down again, as if he couldn't quite process that a single drop of coffee had dared stain his flawless appearance. I'm so sorry," Grace began, feeling the heat rise up her neck. It was just a drop, not even a real spill, more like a coffee tear. He looked at her with an expression that could freeze an erupting volcano. It wasn't exactly anger. It was worse. It was disdain. The kind of look he probably reserved for poorly made PowerPoint slides or badly calculated budget proposals. "A coffee tear," he repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just heard the least funny joke in human history. Grace felt that familiar spark of defiance rise inside her. The same one she felt when professors underestimated her for being a single mom. When classmates assumed she didn't belong at Harvard, when the world seemed determined to remind her that she was always one step behind, always catching up. "Look," she said, shifting the books in her arms and taking a deliberate sip of coffee. "I know one drop of coffee on your $1,000 tie might feel like the end of the world, but here's a free life tip." He raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow, clearly not expecting the clumsy girl to talk back. Grace smiled. Not the sweet, apologetic smile he was probably used to, but the sharp one she saved for moments like this. "As long as my coffee's still hot, I'm still alive. And considering you're still standing and I didn't dump the entire cup over your arrogant head, I'd say we both got lucky today." For a second, just a second, she thought she saw something like amusement flicker in his eyes. But it was gone so fast she probably imagined it. "Interesting life philosophy," he said, his voice still cold but with a slightly different tone. "Hot coffee equals survival. Works better than most advice I get," Grace replied with a shrug. "Especially the ones from men in suits who think the world revolves around them." He looked at her for another long moment, and Grace had the strange feeling she was being evaluated, cataloged, filed away somewhere under irrelevant people who crossed my path. "Excuse me," he finally said, stepping around her as if she were just a minor obstacle in his way. Grace watched him disappear through the revolving doors, his posture stiff, showing no sign that their encounter had affected him at all. To him, she was clearly just another clumsy student who had wasted 5 precious minutes of his life. "You're welcome for the free life tip," she called after him, loud enough that a few nearby students turned and smiled. She took another sip of her coffee, still hot, thank God, and continued toward the library. She had books to return, a daughter to pick up, and a life to live. She didn't have time to think about arrogant men in suits who clearly had never had to balance coffee and real responsibilities. What Grace didn't know, as she pushed through the heavy doors of Widener Library, was that the arrogant man in the suit had stopped on the other side of the revolving doors and looked back, a thoughtful expression replacing the disdain on his face. And for the first time in years, Andrew Walker was genuinely curious about someone. But that, Grace would only find out very soon. Grace never imagined she'd receive an invitation to an academic event on Boston's most exclusive rooftop. Even less that it would be because of an essay on digital innovation in education she had written between a bottle and a dirty diaper. Yet there she was, 3 days after the coffee incident, staring at the golden invitation in her hands as if it were a winning lottery ticket. The Harvard Innovation Summit promised brilliant minds discussing the future of education, and apparently someone had decided she qualified as one of those minds. "Mom, why are you smiling at that paper?" Emma asked, attacking her cereal with the determination of a soldier in battle. "Because sometimes life surprises us, sweetheart," Grace replied, slipping the invitation into her bag. "Sometimes even moms who rush out in pajamas to drop their kids at daycare get to do cool things." The rooftop of the Kendall building offered a breathtaking view of Boston. The city lights were beginning to glow in the twilight, creating a scene straight out of a romantic movie. Grace arrived wearing her only formal dress, a simple black piece she had bought on clearance, suitable for both job interviews and unexpected invitations. The room buzzed with Harvard professors, grad students, and executives who looked like they had just stepped out of Forbes magazine. Grace held a glass in her hand and tried to blend in, pretending she belonged in that world of sophisticated conversations about algorithms and teaching methodologies. Then she saw the stage being set up, and her stomach tightened. A huge banner was being unrolled. Keynote speaker, Andrew Walker, CEO, EduTech Solutions. "No way," she muttered, nearly choking on her wine. "Grace Mitchell." A familiar voice made her turn. Professor Benjamin Cole approached with his usual condescending smile, the one he used when he was about to make someone feel small. "What a surprise to see you here. I didn't know undergraduates were invited to events like this." Benjamin was the kind of professor who wore blazers with leather elbow patches even in the 21st century, as if that added academic credibility to his sarcastic comments. He taught educational policy and had a special talent for making any opposing opinion sound like intellectual blasphemy. "Hi, Professor Cole," Grace replied, forcing a smile. "Apparently some minds don't need a PhD to come up with interesting ideas." "Ah yes, I read your essay," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Creative ideas. A bit naive by academic standards, but creative." Before Grace could respond, the lights dimmed and a voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Andrew Walker." Grace felt her blood freeze. There he was, walking onto the stage with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. The same arrogant man from the coffee incident, now being applauded like an academic celebrity. Andrew began his presentation on the future of educational technology, and Grace had to admit, reluctantly, that he knew what he was talking about. His ideas were innovative, his delivery engaging, and he had a natural charisma that made even his most controversial opinions sound reasonable. Things got interesting when he opened the floor for questions. "Any questions from the audience?" Andrew asked, his eyes scanning the room. Several hands went up, but he pointed directly at Grace. For a moment, she wondered if he recognized her, or if it was just coincidence. "You, in the black dress," he said, and from the slightly amused tone in his voice, Grace was sure he remembered her. Grace stood, feeling every eye turned toward her. "Your ideas about personalized learning are interesting. But how do you deal with the reality that not all students have access to the technology you're proposing? Some of us still rely on old laptops and library Wi-Fi." A murmur went through the audience. Andrew smiled, not a genuine one, but the kind he probably used in business meetings when someone asked an inconvenient question. "A valid concern," he replied. "But innovation always requires initial investment. We can't limit progress based on current limitations." "Oh, I see," Grace said, her tone dripping with false understanding. "So the solution to educational inequality is to ignore that it exists. Very innovative." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Professor Cole looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Andrew gave her that same assessing look he'd given her 3 days earlier. "And what would your solution be, Miss Mitchell?" "Grace Mitchell," she replied, lifting her wineglass slightly. "And my solution would be to start by asking real students what they need. Instead of assuming expensive technology solves everything. Sometimes the simplest answer is the most effective, like hot coffee, for example." The audience laughed, genuinely this time. Some even applauded. "Hot coffee?" Andrew repeated, and Grace saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Yes," Grace said, gaining confidence. "Hot coffee keeps you going when you've had 3 hours of sleep, 2 jobs, and a 5-year-old at home. Technology is great, but hot coffee is essential." The room burst into laughter and applause. Grace felt a wave of satisfaction watching professors and executives laugh at her improvised joke. That's when Professor Cole decided to step in. "How amusing," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "But perhaps we should hear from people with actual experience in education, not just students with coffee anecdotes." The silence that followed was painfully awkward. Grace felt her cheeks burn but kept her chin up. Andrew looked between Grace and Benjamin, clearly weighing his options. For a moment, Grace thought he might defend her. But then he said, "Professor Cole is right. We appreciate everyone's input, but experience matters." Grace felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. She nodded briefly and sat down, pretending the comment hadn't stung. Then Andrew added, almost as an afterthought, "Although I must admit the coffee analogy was memorable. Perhaps we should consider hiring the coffee lady as a consultant." The audience laughed again, but this time Grace didn't join in. She had just been reduced to a joke, the coffee lady, in front of some of the most respected academics in Boston. As the presentation went on, Grace stayed silent, already planning her strategic exit. But one thing was clear. Andrew Walker had just become much more than an awkward hallway encounter. He had become a personal challenge. Grace was in the middle of an epic argument with a vending machine when she received the email that would change her week. The machine had swallowed her last $2 without delivering the promised sandwich, and Grace was seriously considering applying her academic persuasion techniques on the rebellious equipment when her phone buzzed. "Listen here, you ungrateful piece of metal," she muttered to the machine while checking her email. "I need that sandwich more than you need my money," and the words caught in her throat. The email was from Andrew Walker, the very same arrogant CEO who had turned her into the joke of the event 3 days ago. The subject line read simply, "Meeting, EduTech Project, Urgent." Grace read the email twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange into something that made more sense. But no. There it was. Andrew Walker, the man who had once called her the coffee girl in front of Boston's academic elite, was asking for a meeting. "This has to be a mistake," she muttered, giving the vending machine a frustrated punch. Miraculously, the sandwich dropped, or a very elaborate prank. 2 hours later, Grace stood in front of the glass and steel building of EduTech Solutions, right in the heart of Boston's financial district. The lobby screamed, "We spent more on decor than you make in a year." Italian marble floors and a receptionist who looked like she'd just stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Grace Mitchell to see Andrew Walker," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The receptionist gave her a once-over with a polite smile that clearly said, "Are you sure you belong here?" But she checked the system anyway. "30th floor, elevator on the right. He's expecting you." The elevator moved so smoothly Grace barely felt it. When the doors opened, she found herself in another lobby, even more impressive than the first. A perfectly groomed blonde assistant led her down a corridor lined with windows overlooking the city skyline. "Coffee?" the assistant asked as she opened the door to a conference room bigger than Grace's entire apartment. "Always," Grace said automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, yes, please." Andrew was standing by the window, wearing another suit that probably cost more than her used car. When he turned around, she noticed he looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his posture wasn't as perfectly rigid as the last time she'd seen him. "Miss Mitchell," he said, motioning for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." "To be honest, I'm still trying to figure out why you called me," Grace said, sitting down in a chair that probably cost more than her semester's tuition. "Last time we spoke, you turned me into a punchline." Andrew had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "About that." "The coffee girl," Grace went on, taking the cup the assistant handed her. "Very creative. I bet your marketing consultants loved it." "You have every right to be upset," Andrew said, sitting across from her. "But I have to admit, your presentation that night got me thinking." Grace almost choked on her coffee. "My presentation? You mean when Benjamin Cole publicly humiliated me and you just stood there?" "No, before that. Your question about accessibility, your hot coffee analogy," he said, opening a folder. "It made me realize we might be looking at the problem from the wrong angle." Grace eyed him suspiciously. "Go on." "I spent the last 3 days reading your academic work," Andrew said, and Grace felt a wave of panic. Her papers were good, but hardly PhD-level material. Your ideas on educational gamification for low-income families are surprisingly sophisticated. "Surprisingly?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "Because a single mother can't have sophisticated ideas?" "That's not what I meant," Andrew said quickly, a faint blush rising to his cheeks. "I meant your approach is practical in ways most academics can't achieve." Grace took another sip, waiting. She'd learned that silence was often the most effective weapon in conversations like this. "We have a project," Andrew continued, clearly uncomfortable with the pause. "A contract with the Department of Education to develop a digital learning platform for public schools in underprivileged areas. Tight deadline, limited budget, and frankly, we're stuck." "And you thought of the coffee girl," Grace said dryly. "I thought of someone who understands the real constraints we're facing," he corrected. "Someone who knows how to do a lot with very little." Grace studied his face, searching for signs this was some kind of elaborate setup. But Andrew looked genuinely worried, maybe. Not desperate. "What kind of help are you looking for?" she finally asked. "Consulting. Insight. Someone who can tell us whether our ideas will actually work in the real world," Andrew said. "The project's due in 6 weeks. It's paid, of course." Grace almost laughed. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering an opportunity," Andrew corrected. "For both of us. You get experience and income. We get the perspective we clearly need." Grace stayed quiet for a long moment, thinking. On one hand, working with Andrew Walker sounded like a guaranteed headache. On the other, she needed the money, and the experience would look great on her resume. "What are the terms?" she asked. Andrew slid a document across the table. "Part-time consultant, mostly remote work, some in-person meetings when needed. Hourly pay, plus a bonus if we deliver on time." Grace flipped through the contract, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the numbers. It was more than she made from her 2 part-time jobs combined. "This is way too generous," she said suspiciously. "It's what the project's worth," Andrew replied. "I'm willing to pay for what I need." Grace looked at him for another moment, then made a decision she knew she might regret. "Okay," she said, extending her hand. "I'll do it, but I have one condition." Andrew looked both relieved and slightly surprised. "What is it?" Grace smiled. Not the sarcastic smile she'd used at the event, but a genuinely amused one. "If the contract includes unlimited coffee, I'm in," she said. "Because, as we established, hot coffee is essential for survival." Andrew looked at her for a moment and then, to Grace's complete surprise, laughed. A real laugh, not the controlled smile he wore during presentations. "I think that can be arranged," he said, shaking her hand. And just like that, against all odds, Grace Mitchell found herself entering a partnership with the man she had sworn to hate only 3 days earlier. This definitely wasn't going to end well. If someone ever wanted to make a documentary about the struggles of modern life, Grace Mitchell would be the perfect case study. It was Monday morning, and she had already survived 3 crises before 8 a.m. Emma had decided cereal was baby food and would only eat star-shaped pancakes. The washing machine had flooded the kitchen, and her backpack had finally given up under pressure, bursting open and spilling papers and books all over the wet floor. "Mom, why are you making that face like you just ate a lemon?" Emma asked, watching Grace try to save her laptop from a suspicious puddle near the fridge. "Because life likes to test our patience sometimes, sweetheart," Grace said, checking if the computer still worked. "And today, it's giving me the final exam." An hour later, Grace was running through the streets of Cambridge with a plastic bag serving as an improvised backpack, her laptop wrapped in a towel to keep it dry, and the first report for Andrew Walker saved on a flash drive she prayed hadn't drowned in the morning flood. The Boston rain wasn't helping. It was the kind of rain that seemed to have a mind of its own, changing direction just to make sure you got soaked, no matter which way you turned your non-existent umbrella. "Perfect," she muttered, sprinting through the downpour as if she could negotiate with the weather. Exactly the professional image I was going for. She arrived at the cafe near the Harvard campus, looking like a wet dog that had lost a fight with a blender. Her notes were damp, her hair looked like it had been attacked by a rogue blow-dryer, and her white blouse had turned transparent enough to reveal that she was wearing a bra covered in tiny flamingos, Emma's Mother's Day gift. That was when she saw Andrew Walker sitting in the corner, working on his spotless MacBook Pro, perfectly dry and as polished as ever. "Great," Grace whispered to herself, "because that's exactly what I needed today." She walked to the counter to order her life-saving coffee, trying to ignore the puddle forming under her shoes. The barista, an art student with a nose piercing and the expression of someone questioning all his life choices, looked at her with a mix of pity and curiosity. "Rough morning?" he asked, preparing her double oat milk latte. "Rough life," Grace replied. "But as long as the coffee's hot, I'll survive." She grabbed her drink and turned to find a table, pretending not to notice Andrew. Of course, that lasted exactly 3 seconds, because the universe clearly had a sense of humor. "Grace?" Andrew called, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. She turned around, forcing a smile, even though she looked like a shipwreck survivor. "Oh, hi! What a coincidence!" Andrew looked her up and down, and Grace could see the exact moment he processed her current state. To his credit, he didn't laugh. He didn't even smile, but she definitely saw his eyes widen slightly. "You are soaked," he said, demonstrating his exceptional observation skills. "Brilliant deduction," Grace replied, taking her laptop out of the blanket. "Boston rain has this annoying habit of getting people wet." "You don't own an umbrella?" Grace looked at him as if he had asked whether she owned a private jet. "Umbrellas are for people who have time to remember things like weather forecasts. I'm more the type who discovers it's raining when I'm already running so I won't be late." Andrew gestured to the empty chair at his table. "Would you like to sit? You look like you need to dry off." Grace hesitated. Sitting with Andrew Walker in a cafe while looking like a drenched animal was not exactly part of her plan to impress the CEO. But her options were limited, and at least his table had an outlet to charge her laptop. "Thank you," she said, sitting down and immediately creating a small puddle around the chair. Andrew closed his laptop and watched her open hers carefully. Grace noticed he seemed genuinely curious about her routine, first turning it on, then checking if all her files were intact, finally breathing in relief once everything worked. "How old is that laptop?" he asked. "Old enough to vote," Grace said, opening her document. "But it still works, and that's what matters." She began working, editing the report she had prepared about accessibility on educational platforms. Andrew, instead of returning to his own work, simply watched her. Grace could feel his eyes on her as she typed, and it made her strangely self-conscious. "What are you doing?" she finally asked, without looking up from the screen. "Watching you work," Andrew replied honestly. "It's interesting." "Interesting like a car accident or interesting like a puzzle?" "Interesting like someone who can stay completely focused while looking like they just went through a hurricane." Grace finally looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something different in his eyes. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't amusement. It looked like respect. "Do you have children?" she asked suddenly. "No," Andrew replied. "Because people without kids always think it's impressive when parents manage to function under pressure," Grace said, turning back to the screen. "For us, that's just Tuesday." Andrew stayed quiet for a moment. "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Balance everything: college, work, motherhood, and now our project." Grace stopped typing and really looked at him this time. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Genuine curiosity, maybe even admiration. "Coffee," she said simply. "A lot of coffee, obsessive lists, and accepting that perfection is a myth invented by people who have nannies." "And if the coffee runs out?" Grace smiled, not the sarcastic smile she usually used with him, but a real one. "Then I improvise. Like this morning, when my backpack burst and I had to use a pharmacy bag." Andrew looked at the crumpled plastic bag beside her chair, then at the old laptop, then at Grace, soaked, messy, but fully focused on her work. "You are not just a student," he said, almost to himself. "Thank you for noticing," Grace replied, and her voice held no sarcasm this time. There was something softer there, almost vulnerable. They sat in silence for a few minutes, Grace typing while Andrew watched her with a thoughtful expression. The cafe buzzed around them, students discussing projects, professors grading papers, the barista calling out complicated coffee orders. But at their small table, there was a strange quiet. When Grace finally closed her laptop, Andrew was still looking at her. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, but he didn't look away. "It's just you're different from what I thought." "Different how?" Andrew seemed to search for the right words. "Stronger. More real." Grace felt something unusual happening in her chest, something warm that had nothing to do with coffee. "Well," she said, getting up and placing the laptop into the improvised bag, "reality is my specialty." As she left the cafe, Grace didn't see Andrew continue to look out the window, watching her run through the rain again, with a completely new expression on his face. Grace should have known something was wrong when Andrew invited her to present her ideas to the Edutech Solutions Board of Directors. Not that the opportunity wasn't incredible. It was the kind of chance undergraduate students dreamed of. But Andrew had extended the invitation with the same expression of someone who had just swallowed bitter medicine. "It is a great opportunity," he had said the previous week, avoiding direct eye contact. "The board needs to see the project's progress." Grace should have questioned why he seemed more nervous than she was about the presentation. She should have wondered why Benjamin Cole would also be present. She should have trusted the feeling that something was not right. Instead, she spent 3 sleepless nights preparing slides about educational accessibility, practicing her presentation in the bathroom mirror while Emma slept, and imagining what it would be like to impress a room full of important executives. The boardroom was intimidating enough to make Grace reconsider all her life choices. A mahogany table that looked like it had cost more than a car, leather chairs that whispered, "You do not belong here," every time someone moved, and a panoramic view of Boston that made you feel as if you were looking at the world from a divine altitude. Grace arrived 15 minutes early, carrying her old laptop and a presentation she had reviewed so many times she could recite it in her sleep. She wore her only blazer, bought on sale at Macy's 2 years earlier, and had made sure to bring her favorite thermal cup filled with coffee. Some traditions were sacred. The board members began arriving one by one, men in expensive suits and a woman who looked like she had stepped straight out of a Fortune magazine cover. Grace smiled and greeted each one, trying to project more confidence than she actually felt. Andrew entered with Benjamin Cole, who wore his blazer with leather patches like academic armor. Grace noticed that Andrew seemed tense, almost pale, but Benjamin looked radiant in a way that made her stomach tighten. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrew began, his voice sounding strangely formal, "this is Grace Mitchell, our consultant for the Department of Education project. She will present some ideas on accessibility." Grace noticed the hesitation in the word ideas, but chose to ignore it. She connected her laptop to the projector and began her presentation, explaining how educational platforms could be adapted for low-income students without sacrificing quality or functionality. For 20 minutes, everything went perfectly. Her ideas about offline gamification, systems that worked on older devices, and simplified interfaces for parents with low digital literacy were received with approving nods and a few thoughtful questions. That was when Benjamin decided to attack. "Interesting," he said, raising his hand as if he were in a university classroom. "But I have some concerns about these suggestions." Grace felt a warning chill, but kept her smile. "Of course, Professor Cole, what are your concerns?" Benjamin stood, adopting his usual condescending professor posture. "Well, first, these ideas are based on personal anecdotes, not on rigorous academic research. Second, simplifying technology to the level you suggest may be seen as condescending toward the communities we aim to serve." Grace felt her blood heat. "With all due respect, Professor Cole, my recommendations are based on real experience with technological limitations. It is not condescension, it is practicality." "Real experience," Benjamin repeated, making air quotes. "You mean your experience as a low-income undergraduate student? That does not qualify as proper research." The silence in the room was intense. Grace looked around the table and saw expressions ranging from discomfort to a kind of uneasy curiosity, the kind of people who watched a car accident, not out of cruelty but out of involuntary fascination with human drama. "Besides," Benjamin continued, clearly gaining momentum, "implementing these ideas may compromise the academic integrity of the project. We are talking about education, not coffee shop improvisations." Grace felt as if she had been punched. Benjamin had just reduced all her work to coffee shop improvisations in front of the company's most important executives. She looked at Andrew, hoping he would step in, that he would defend the work they had built together. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something that might have been conflict, perhaps even guilt. But then Andrew looked at the board members, reading their expressions, and Grace realized he was calculating, weighing the political cost of defending her against the opinion of a respected Harvard professor. "Professor Cole raises valid points," Andrew finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps we should consider approaches that are more academically grounded." Grace felt the world stop for a second. Andrew had just chosen a side, and it was not hers. But instead of breaking down or exploding, Grace did something that surprised even herself. She smiled. "I understand," she said, closing her laptop with deliberate calm. "Of course you need to prioritize academic credentials over practical results. After all, what matters is not whether solutions work, but whether they sound impressive in papers." Benjamin opened his mouth to respond, but Grace was not finished. "But I will leave you with a thought," she continued, placing her things in her bag. "You are developing technology for children who go home to apartments without reliable internet, for parents who work 3 jobs and do not have time to learn complicated systems. These people do not need academically elegant solutions. They need things that work." She stood, picked up her travel mug, and took a very intentional sip of her coffee. "I am glad my coffee did not get cold," she said, her voice full of irony. "At least it believes in me." The room burst into nervous laughter. Some of the board members seemed genuinely amused, others clearly uncomfortable. Benjamin looked as if he had swallowed a whole lemon. Grace walked toward the door with her head held high, but she stopped at the doorway. "Oh, and Professor Cole," she said, turning back. "When your academically rigorous solutions fail in the real world, and they will fail, remember that a low-income undergraduate tried to warn you." And with that, she left. Behind her a room full of stunned executives and a CEO who seemed to be having an existential crisis. Grace did not look back as she walked down the hallway. She could not, because if she did, Andrew might see the tears she was struggling to hold back. In the elevator, going down 30 floors back to reality, Grace took another sip of her coffee and tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing. Dignity, she decided, was worth more than any contract, even if dignity did not pay rent. Grace decided that the Harvard Cafe was the perfect place to have an existential crisis. At least there, with the smell of roasted coffee and the sound of stressed students all around, her life falling apart felt almost normal. 3 days had passed since the disaster in the meeting room, and Grace had spent each of them trying to convince Emma and herself that everything was fine. That losing a contract that paid more in a week than she earned in a month was just a temporary setback. That being embarrassed in front of important executives was life experience. That dignity truly was worth more than financial stability. Emma was not believing any of it. "Mom, are you eating your blueberry muffin or just staring at it with an angry face?" Emma asked, swinging her legs on the high cafe chair. She had insisted on coming with Grace for her afternoon coffee, mostly because she knew it meant hot chocolate with whipped cream. Grace looked at the untouched muffin in front of her. "I am contemplating its existential possibilities." Is that an adult way of saying you are sad? Sometimes Grace wondered if Emma was too grown up for her 5 years. "Maybe a little sad," she admitted. "Is it because of the boring man in the suit?" Grace almost spit out her coffee. "How do you know about the man in the suit?" "You talk in your sleep," Emma said matter-of-factly, licking whipped cream off her spoon. "You said, 'Andrew Walker, you are a coward,' 3 times last night." "I do not talk in my sleep," Grace protested, then remembered a vague dream where she poured hot coffee on Andrew's expensive tie. "All right, maybe I talk a little." "So he really is boring?" Grace sighed. "Not exactly boring, more like complicated. Sometimes he seems nice, and sometimes he acts like he is afraid of his own opinions." "Like Tommy in my class," Emma said seriously. "He wants to play with me, but when the other boys are watching, he pretends he does not know me." The simplicity of the observation hit Grace like lightning. "That is surprisingly insightful, sweetie." "What does insightful mean?" "It means you are very smart for a 5-year-old. Emma smiled proudly and went back to her hot chocolate. Grace was about to take a bite of her muffin when a familiar shadow fell across the table. "Grace?" She looked up, and there was Andrew Walker, looking more uncomfortable than she had ever seen him. His perfect suit was slightly wrinkled, there were dark circles under his eyes, and he was holding 2 cafe cups as if they were shields. "Andrew," Grace said, her voice carefully neutral. "What a surprise." Emma looked between the 2 adults with the scientific curiosity of a child who had just discovered a new kind of insect. "Is this the boring man in the suit?" Grace felt her face flush. "Emma?" No, Andrew said, and to Grace's complete shock, he smiled. "She is right, I have been quite difficult lately." He looked at Emma, then at Grace. "May I sit? I brought coffee, as a peace offering." Grace motioned to the empty chair, mostly because Emma was staring at Andrew as if he were a particularly interesting zoo animal. "Are you really a millionaire?" Emma asked the moment he sat down. "Emma," Grace protested again. "Technically, yes," Andrew replied, looking amused. "Why? Because you don't look like a millionaire. You look tired." Andrew laughed, a genuine laugh that made something unfamiliar stir in Grace's chest. "You are very direct, aren't you?" "Mom says it is better to be honest than polite," Emma explained. "Except with teachers. With teachers you must be polite even when they are wrong." Grace covered her face with her hands. "I am sorry, she has no filter." "No, I like it," Andrew said, sliding one of the coffees toward Grace. "It is refreshing. Most people only tell me what they think I want to hear." Grace accepted the coffee, noticing he had ordered it exactly the way she liked. Double shot, oat milk, a touch of cinnamon. "How do you know my order?" Andrew looked slightly embarrassed. Pay attention." "Is that stalking or being thoughtful?" Grace asked, though a faint smile played at her lips. "Hopefully thoughtful," Andrew replied. "Although I understand if you prefer the first option after what happened at the meeting." The elephant in the room had finally been acknowledged. Grace took a sip of the coffee, perfect, unfortunately, and studied Andrew's face. "You came here to apologize?" "I came to try to explain," Andrew said. "And yes, to apologize, but mostly to admit that you were right." Emma stopped drinking her hot chocolate to watch the scene unfold. It was like watching her favorite soap opera. Right about what? About everything. About practical solutions. About knowing the real audience. About Benjamin being a... "Careful," Grace warned, nodding toward Emma. "About Benjamin being academically inflexible," Andrew corrected. "Ooh," Emma said. "That was a big word. What does it mean?" "It means he cares more about being right than helping people," Grace explained. "Like the school principal when he will not let us use the playground in the rain." "Exactly like that," Andrew said, clearly impressed by the comparison. Grace looked at Andrew for a long moment. "Why didn't you defend me in the meeting?" Andrew sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair and messing it up. "Because I am a coward, because I was worried about my reputation, the board's opinion, keeping Benjamin pleased. And now? Now I realize my reputation means nothing if it was built on pushing talented people aside." Grace felt something soften inside her. That was almost a decent apology. "Almost? You missed the part where you admit my ideas were brilliant." Andrew smiled. "Your ideas were brilliant, revolutionary, and I was a fool for not recognizing that in front of everyone." Emma clapped. "That was better. Now are you two going to kiss?" "Emma!" Grace cried, feeling her face burn. Andrew laughed until tears formed in his eyes. "She truly has no filter, does she?" "None," Grace confirmed, though she was laughing too. "It is genetically impossible for her to keep a thought inside her head." "That must be where she gets her honesty," Andrew said, looking at Grace with an expression she could not fully read. "Probably," Grace admitted, "although I usually add some sarcasm to mine." "I noticed. It is one of the things I like most about you." The words lingered in the air between them. Grace felt butterflies somersaulting in her stomach. "One of the things?" she asked, surprised at her own boldness. Andrew looked directly into her eyes. "Your intelligence, your determination, the way you make everything seem possible even when it is clearly impossible. And my ability to almost spill coffee on important executives?" "Especially that," Andrew said, his smile growing softer. "It was the first time in years someone treated me like a normal human being instead of a corporate title." Grace took another sip of coffee, trying to process the surreal conversation she was having. "So," she said finally, "what happens now?" Andrew leaned forward. "Now I ask if you would give me a second chance, to do this right this time." Grace looked at Emma, who was watching the exchange with obvious fascination, then back at Andrew. "If this second chance includes unlimited coffee and no interference from professors with a superiority complex," she said, "then maybe we can talk." Andrew smiled, not the corporate smile he used in presentations, but something genuine and slightly vulnerable. "I believe that can be arranged." Grace was in the middle of a brilliant idea when Emma decided it was the perfect time to stage a theatrical play using her Barbie dolls and the neighbor's cat as the unwilling audience. "Mom, can you do a princess voice for the Dr. Barbie?" Emma called from the living room floor, where she had created what she called an emergency hospital for dolls with drama. "In 1 minute, sweetheart," Grace replied without taking her eyes off the laptop screen. For the first time in weeks, everything was falling into place. The solution that had been nudging her mind for days was finally taking shape, and she could see exactly how to fix the issue that had been troubling the EduTech project. The issue was simple but complicated. How to create an educational platform that worked both for schools with advanced technology and for those where the internet connection was slower than a snail with arthritis. Andrew's team had spent months trying to develop 2 separate versions, but that doubled the cost and delayed timelines. Grace, however, had an epiphany while watching Emma play an offline game on the family's old tablet. "Eureka!" she exclaimed, making the neighbor's cat jump off the window and Emma stare at her as if she had lost her mind. "Did you find gold?" Emma asked hopefully. "Better than gold, baby. I found a way to save a multi-million-dollar project." 2 hours later, Grace was at the EduTech office, practically vibrating with excitement as she waited for Andrew to review her proposal. She had arrived 15 minutes early, which for her was the equivalent of arriving a full day ahead. Andrew walked into the conference room carrying his inevitable cup of coffee and an expression that mixed curiosity with careful skepticism. In the past few days, since the coffee shop conversation, they had established a kind of professional truce. He had stopped treating her as a disposable consultant, and she had stopped making sarcastic comments about the expensive office decor. "So," Andrew said, taking a seat across from her, "you said you had a solution for our little compatibility crisis?" "Little?" Grace repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Andrew, you are spending twice the budget trying to develop 2 different platforms. That is not little, that is catastrophic." "Thank you for the optimistic perspective," he replied dryly. "But you said you had a solution?" Grace smiled and opened her laptop. How about a single platform that adjusts automatically to the available technology? Andrew looked at her as if she had suggested training unicorns to deliver educational content. That is theoretically impossible. It is theoretically impossible for people who think inside the box, Grace corrected, turning the screen toward him. But what if the platform itself were smart enough to detect connection speed and adjust its content in real time? She began to explain her idea. A system that worked like a digital nesting doll. The full version, with all interactive and visual features, would be available for schools with strong infrastructure. But if the platform detected slow internet or limited hardware, it would automatically peel itself, removing unnecessary elements and prioritizing function over form. It is like having an educational transformer, Grace said, clearly proud of the analogy. The same core functionality, different visual presentations, depending on what the system can support. Andrew studied the diagrams on the screen, his expression slowly shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. Grace could almost see the gears turning in his mind as he processed the implications. This could actually work, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Of course it could work, Grace said. The real question is, does your development team have the courage to think beyond the corporate sandbox? That was when Benjamin Cole chose to make his grand entrance, holding a folder that most likely contained academic objections organized alphabetically. Andrew, I need to speak with you about the Department of Education guidelines, Benjamin announced, stopping abruptly when he saw Grace. Oh, the consultant is still here. Professor Cole, Grace said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Perfect timing. I was just showing Andrew how to solve our compatibility problem. Benjamin looked at the laptop screen as if he were examining evidence from a crime scene. And what exactly is this solution? Grace explained her idea again, watching Benjamin's expression grow more sour with every word. When she finished, a tense silence filled the room. Interesting, Benjamin said at last, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but interesting. But I am sure our development team has already considered adaptive approaches. Actually, no, Andrew said, still studying the diagrams. We were so focused on building strong solutions that we did not consider smart solutions. Grace saw a muscle tighten in Benjamin's jaw. Smart solutions require extensive research and rigorous testing. We cannot simply implement untested ideas based on intuition. My intuition has a Harvard diploma and 3 years of experience living with limited technology, Grace replied. What qualifications does your research have to understand the reality of a family sharing one laptop among 3 children? Andrew looked between Grace and Benjamin like a judge observing a particularly engaging debate. Grace could see he was impressed, not only with her solution, but with how she defended her ideas. Grace has a point, Andrew finally said. Maybe it is time to prioritize functionality over academic protocol. Benjamin's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. Academic protocol exists for a reason, Andrew. We cannot simply. Benjamin, Grace cut in, her voice sweet as honey with poison mixed in. If even you understood my explanation, then I must be on the right track. The room was silent for 3 full seconds before Andrew burst into laughter. It was not a polite chuckle or a corporate smile, but genuine laughter that brought tears to his eyes. Benjamin looked as if he had swallowed a whole lemon followed by a dose of vinegar. That was, Andrew said, trying to regain composure, the funniest thing I have heard in months. Grace batted her eyelashes at him with exaggerated innocence. I was being completely sincere. Education should be accessible to everyone, including professors with limited senses of humor. Andrew laughed again, and this time Grace joined him. There was something conspiratorial in their laughter, as if they were sharing a private joke that Benjamin could not understand. Benjamin, clearly realizing he had lost control of the situation, straightened his folder with wounded dignity. I will let you discuss technical implementation. I have real academic matters to attend to. When the door closed behind him, Andrew and Grace exchanged a look that lasted a few seconds longer than was professionally appropriate. You know, you just made a lifelong enemy, right? Andrew said, though his tone was more admiring than concerned. Benjamin was already my enemy, Grace replied. At least now it is official. Andrew studied her face for a moment, then smiled. Not the smile he used in meetings, but something softer, more personal. "You know something? I think I'm going to enjoy working with you." Grace felt butterflies performing acrobatics in her stomach. "Only if you can keep up." "That sounds like a challenge." "That is a promise." They looked at each other for another moment, and Grace had the strange feeling that something had shifted between them. It was no longer just about spilled coffee or professional projects. It was about two intelligent people discovering that they liked each other more than was strictly necessary. Grace should have noticed something was wrong when Benjamin Cole suddenly became polite with her. Men who spent weeks treating you as a minor inconvenience do not wake up one morning and decide to praise your interesting work and suggest future collaborations. But Grace was far too busy enjoying her recent victory to pay attention to warning signs. In the last 5 days, since she had presented her transform solution, the project had taken on a life of its own. The development team was enthusiastic, Andrew was impressed, and even the most conservative investors were showing signs of approval. For one glorious moment, Grace allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going right. She should have known the universe would not allow that to happen without drama. The bomb arrived on a Tuesday morning, disguised as a polite email from Harvard's Office of Academic Affairs. Grace was in the kitchen, trying to convince Emma that oatmeal with fruit was an acceptable breakfast and not a cruel and unusual punishment, when her phone beeped. "Mom, why do you look like you just saw a ghost?" Emma asked, watching Grace read the email for the 3rd time. "Because maybe I did," Grace murmured, rereading the words that seemed to be written in a foreign language. Academic irregularities, conflict of interest, preliminary investigation. The email was a masterpiece of bureaucratic language, but the message was clear. Someone had suggested that Grace was using her position as a Harvard student to gain unfair advantage in business contracts. Someone had questioned whether her work at EduTech violated the university's conflict of interest policies. Someone whose initials were BC and who wore blazers with leather patches. Grace felt a familiar mix of anger and resignation rising in her chest. It was the same feeling she had when she discovered the car would not start on the day of an important exam, or when the daycare called saying Emma was sick on the very day she had a job interview. It was the feeling that no matter how hard she tried, there would always be someone ready to pull the rug out from under her feet. "Emma," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we have breakfast out today? Mommy needs to make some calls." 2 hours later, Grace was at the EduTech office for the last time. She had spent the whole morning reviewing Harvard's conflict of interest policies, consulting the student support office, and reaching the unavoidable conclusion: Benjamin had found a legally valid way to make her life impossible. Technically, he was right. There was a gray area in the university's policies about students working on commercial projects related to their studies. Grace could fight it, hire a lawyer, and spend months in bureaucratic meetings. Or she could leave before it turned into a scandal that harmed both her and Andrew. The choice was obvious, even if painful. Andrew was in the conference room reviewing prototypes of the new platform when Grace knocked on the door. He looked up and smiled, that new smile he had developed over the past few weeks, softer and more genuine than his corporate version. "Grace." Perfect timing. "The development team wants to discuss the implementation of the adaptive system." "Andrew," Grace gently interrupted, "I need to talk to you." Something in her voice made his smile disappear. "What happened?" Grace closed the door behind her and sat in the chair that had become hers in recent weeks. "Funny how quickly you could get used to things that were never really yours." "I received an email from Harvard today," she began, sliding a printed copy across the table, "about conflicts of interest." Andrew read the document, his expression growing darker with each line. "Benjamin," he said at last, and it was not a question. "Benjamin," Grace confirmed. "He found a way to remove me from the project without looking like the villain. Technically, he may be right about the conflict policies." "This is absurd," Andrew said, tossing the paper on the table. "You are not doing anything unethical. You are providing expertise we desperately needed." "I know that. You know that. Even Benjamin knows that," Grace said. But policy is policy, and I cannot afford to fight a legal battle against Harvard. Andrew studied her for a long moment. You are giving up. I am being practical, Grace corrected. There is a difference. Not in this case. Grace gave a sad smile. Andrew, I am a single mother trying to graduate from one of the most expensive universities in the country. I cannot risk my academic standing for a project, no matter how much I believe in it. What if we find a way around it? We could. No, Grace said firmly. I do not want you to get into trouble because of me. I have caused enough complications already. Andrew stood and began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. A gesture Grace had learned to recognize as a sign of deep frustration. This is not right, he said. Benjamin cannot just… Of course he can, Grace cut in. And we both know he will, so I'm going to make things easier for everyone. She opened her bag and set a flash drive on the table along with a neatly organized folder. All my research, all the specifications for the adaptive platform, implementation timelines. Your team has enough talent to continue without me. Andrew stopped pacing and looked at her. Grace? It's all right, she said, standing up. Honestly, maybe this is for the best. I go back to my simple student life. You keep being a successful CEO, and everyone stays happy. I will not be happy, Andrew said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Grace felt something tighten in her chest, a mix of sadness and something she did not want to name. Andrew, no, he said, taking a step toward her. Let me say this. These last few weeks, working with you, have been the best I've had in years. You challenge me, make me laugh, make me see things differently. Grace felt tears threatening to rise and blinked quickly to hold them back. Stop. Why? Because this won't work and we both know it. Grace grabbed her bag and headed for the door. You're Andrew Walker, a Millionaire CEO. I'm Grace Mitchell, a broke single mom. This isn't a Cinderella story. Maybe not, Andrew said, but it could be something better, something real. Grace stopped with her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine how things might be if circumstances were different. Then she shook her head and opened the door. The coffee's hot, but my heart can't take it anymore, she said, without turning back to him. At the reception desk, while waiting for the elevator, Grace heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around, because she knew if she did, she might change her mind. Grace, Andrew called. Don't make this harder than it already is, she said to the elevator, which seemed to be taking an eternity to arrive. When the doors finally opened, Grace stepped inside without looking back. But in the reflection of the metal doors, she saw Andrew standing in the hallway, watching her leave with an expression that was part frustration, part admiration, and part something she didn't want to analyze too deeply. As the elevator descended, Grace allowed herself to cry for exactly 30 seconds. After that, she wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and began planning how to explain to Emma that they were back to normal life. Whatever normal meant for a single mother who had just fallen for her boss and decided to do the right thing. Grace should have been suspicious when Benjamin Cole started greeting her in the Harvard halls with smiles that looked like they'd been borrowed from a used car salesman. Professors who'd ignored her for months didn't suddenly wake up deciding she was worthy of academic recognition. But Grace was too busy trying to rebuild her post-edutech life to notice the warning signs. Over the past 10 days, she had thrown herself back into the routine of a regular student. Classes, library, part-time jobs, and pretending she wasn't obsessively checking education tech news to see if Andrew's project was making progress. Emma, of course, had noticed her mother's change in mood. 5-year-olds have a supernatural radar for when adults are pretending everything's fine. Mom, you're eating chocolate cereal for dinner again, Emma observed, swinging her legs on the kitchen chair. That's something sad people do. I'm not sad, Grace lied, taking a spoonful of Lucky Charms at 7 in the evening. I'm just redefining my nutritional priorities. That's an adult way of saying you're eating junk because you missed the man in the suit, right? Sometimes Grace wondered if Emma should consider a career in child psychology. How do you know I miss him? Because you keep looking at your phone like it's going to talk to you, Emma said matter-of-factly. And you sigh a lot. Like a lot. Grace was about to deny the excessive sighing allegations when her phone buzzed. For one pathetic moment her heart leapt, but it was just a message from the library about an overdue book. "See?" Emma said, pointing accusingly. "You made a disappointed face. Definitely the man in the suit." The bomb dropped Thursday morning, disguised as an email from the academic department with the subject line, "Academic Conduct Investigation, Mandatory Attendance." Grace read the email 3 times, each reading making her stomach sink lower. Words like plagiarism, data fabrication, and serious academic misconduct danced across the screen like tiny bureaucratic demons. Someone had accused Grace of plagiarizing parts of her thesis on educational technology. Someone had claimed she'd fabricated research data to support her theories. Someone had alleged that her work with EduTech involved improper use of Harvard's academic resources. Someone whose initials were BC, who had clearly decided that destroying Grace's career was a suitable hobby. "This can't be happening," Grace whispered, reading the email for the 4th time. But it was happening, and it got worse fast. By 10 a.m., Grace had been summoned to a meeting with the Academic Ethics Committee. By 11, rumors about the student who stole ideas to sell to companies were already spreading through the halls. By 2 in the afternoon, the story had evolved into the single mother who scammed Harvard for million-dollar contracts. The academic rumor mill was more efficient than the internet at spreading gossip. Grace spent the day moving through curious looks, poorly hidden whispers, and the growing feeling that she was being judged and condemned before she even had a chance to defend herself. It felt like standing in a courtroom where everyone had already decided she was guilty. "Grace," a familiar voice called as she was leaving the library. Sarah Chen, a classmate and one of the few people who truly knew her at Harvard, rushed to catch up. "Sarah," Grace said, relieved to see a friendly face. "At least someone is still talking to me." "What on earth is going on?" Sarah asked, direct as always. "Everyone is talking about you and something about academic fraud. That is crazy, right?" "Completely crazy," Grace confirmed. "Someone decided that my work at EduTech was unethical, and now I am being investigated for academic crimes I did not even know existed." "What kind of crimes?" "Apparently, using my Harvard research to develop commercial solutions counts as misappropriation of academic resources," Grace explained. "And Benjamin Cole is suggesting that I invented data to support my theories." Sarah grimaced. "Cole, the professor with the blazers and elbow patches? That man has serious issues with women in leadership." "Well, now he found a legal way to express those issues," Grace said bitterly. That was when she saw Andrew walking across campus toward them, his expression a mix of determination and frustration. Grace felt her heart jump, followed immediately by a wave of panic. "Grace," he said once he was close enough to speak, "we need to talk." Sarah looked between them with obvious curiosity. I will let you two talk. Grace, call me if you need anything, all right?" When Sarah walked away, Andrew and Grace stood in the middle of campus like two people who were not quite sure how to start a difficult conversation. "I heard about the investigation," Andrew said at last. "News travels fast," Grace replied, trying to sound casual. "Harvard has a very efficient gossip system." "This is ridiculous," Andrew said, his voice filled with controlled anger. "Benjamin is clearly using this to get back at you." "Probably," Grace agreed. "But ridiculous or not, this is what is happening." Andrew stepped closer. "Let me help. I can testify about your work, prove that your ideas were original." "Andrew, no," Grace interrupted. "You cannot be involved in this." "Why not?" "Because you are the CEO of a company that benefited from my work," Grace explained patiently. "Your testimony would look biased, as if you were trying to protect your own interests." Andrew looked frustrated. "Then what can I do?" "Nothing," Grace said simply. "At least not now. I need to fight this battle on my own." "This is not right." "Many things are not right," Grace replied, "but it is the reality I have." They stood in silence for a moment, watching students walk past them, unaware of the drama unfolding. "Grace," Andrew said finally, his voice softer. "You know I believe in you, don't you?" Grace felt tears threaten to rise. "I know, but sometimes believing is not enough." "It should be. In a perfect world it would be," Grace agreed. "But we do not live in a perfect world. We live in a world where jealous professors can destroy careers with unfounded accusations." Andrew looked like he wanted to say more, but Grace shook her head. "I need to go," she said. "I have a meeting with the ethics committee in 1 hour, and I still need to prepare my defense." "Grace? Andrew, please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Do not make this harder than it already is." She turned and began to walk away, but stopped after a few steps. "And Andrew?" she said without turning back. "Thank you for believing in me. It means more than you know." As she walked away, Grace could feel Andrew's eyes on her. She could also feel other students watching, whispers following her like a soundtrack of judgment. In a matter of hours, Benjamin Cole had managed to turn Grace Mitchell from a respected consultant into an academic outcast. He had taken her greatest achievement and turned it into evidence of misconduct. It was, Grace had to admit, a brilliantly cruel move. Now she just needed to figure out how to survive it. Grace never imagined her academic career would be decided in a room that looked like it had been decorated by someone with an obsession for mahogany and portraits of men who had been dead for a long time. The Harvard Faculty Club was impressive in an intimidating way, as if every piece of furniture whispered, "You do not belong here," in Latin. But there she was, 3 days after the disastrous meeting with the ethics committee, preparing for what the dean had diplomatically called a public hearing for clarification of academic allegations. Grace preferred to call it the trial where Benjamin Cole tries to destroy my life in front of an audience. The room was full. Professors, students, reporters from the Harvard Crimson, and even a few curious people who clearly had nothing better to do on a Friday afternoon. Grace noticed Andrew sitting in the back, trying to look inconspicuous in a suit that probably cost more than the GDP of some small countries. Emma was in the front row, brought by the babysitter Grace had managed to borrow from the neighbor. Her daughter had insisted on coming, claiming that moms need a cheering section when they are fighting against annoying professors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean Morrison began, adjusting his reading glasses, "we are here to review the allegations of academic misconduct against the student Grace Mitchell." Benjamin Cole was seated at the accuser's table, radiating confidence like a cat that had just cornered a particularly plump mouse. He had dressed for the occasion, his best blazer with leather patches, a tie that announced, "I have a PhD," and an expression that suggested he was doing humanity a favor. "Professor Cole," the dean said, "would you like to present your allegations?" Benjamin stood with the pomp of a prosecutor in a courtroom drama. "Thank you, Dean Morrison. As detailed in my report, Miss Mitchell has demonstrated a concerning pattern of academic misconduct." He began listing his accusations with the precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing every word. Plagiarism of existing concepts, fabrication of research data, improper use of university resources for commercial gain. Grace listened in silence, taking notes and trying not to laugh at the irony of being accused of stealing ideas by a man who had clearly spent decades recycling the same outdated pedagogical theories. When Benjamin finished his presentation, which lasted 20 minutes and included 3 PowerPoint slides apparently designed to cure insomnia, the dean turned to Grace. "Miss Mitchell, would you like to respond to the allegations?" Grace stood, straightened her carefully organized papers, and smiled. It was not a nervous or apologetic smile. It was the smile she reserved for moments when she was about to put on a show. "Thank you, Dean Morrison. First, I would like to thank Professor Cole for this opportunity," she began, her voice clear and confident. "It is not every day that an undergraduate student has the chance to teach a professor how academic research actually works." A murmur spread through the audience. Benjamin looked as if he had swallowed an especially sour lemon. "Let us begin with the accusation of plagiarism," Grace continued, turning on her laptop and projecting her first slide. "Professor Cole claims that I stole concepts from existing researchers. Interesting theory, considering that all my sources are meticulously cited." She clicked through slides showing her bibliography, complete with citations in perfect APA format. "As you can see, I referenced 127 different sources. If that is plagiarism, then apparently every academic in history is guilty of the same crime." Nervous laughter echoed around the room. Grace noticed a few professors trying to hide smiles. "Now, regarding the fabrication of data," Grace said, moving to the next slide. Professor Cole suggests that I invented statistics to support my theories. Fortunately, I have something called documentation. She began showing her research data, complete with timestamps, verifiable sources, and transparent methodology. All of this data is publicly accessible through the U.S. Department of Education database. Anyone can verify it. It is literally one Google search away. Benjamin was beginning to look uncomfortable, like someone who had just realized he had brought a knife to a tank battle. But my favorite part, Grace continued, her voice gaining a playful tone, is the allegation of improper use of university resources. Apparently, using knowledge gained at Harvard to solve real-world problems is unethical. She turned to look directly at Benjamin. Professor Cole, by your logic, any student who gets a job after graduation should be accused of misconduct for applying what they learned here. Should Harvard sue everyone who uses their education to improve their lives? The audience was openly laughing now. Grace saw some professors exchanging amused looks. Furthermore, Grace added, clicking to a new slide, I would like to point out that my innovations in educational technology have already been implemented in 3 school districts in Massachusetts, benefiting more than 12,000 students. If that is misconduct, then perhaps we need to redefine our ethical standards. Benjamin finally found his voice. Miss Mitchell, your jokes do not change the fact that you violated established protocols. Protocols established by whom? Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. And when exactly were these protocols established? Because I looked, Professor Cole, and I could not find any official Harvard policy that prohibits students from using academic knowledge to create practical solutions. She paused, letting the silence grow for a moment. Unless you are suggesting that the knowledge acquired here should remain purely theoretical, that a Harvard education should not have real-world application? Benjamin opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. That is not, you are twisting. I am asking questions, Grace corrected him gently. Questions any serious researcher should be able to answer. It was then that Andrew stood up at the back of the room. Every head turned toward him, and Grace felt her heart jump. Excuse me, Andrew said, his voice carrying across the room. May I make an observation? Dean Morrison looked surprised but nodded. And you are? Andrew Walker, CEO of EduTech Solutions, Andrew replied, walking toward the front of the room. And I would like to testify regarding the character and contributions of Grace Mitchell. Benjamin looked as if he were having a heart attack. This is irregular. He cannot. Actually, the dean interrupted, this is an open forum. Mr. Walker may share his observations. Andrew took a place beside Grace, and she felt a wave of strength she had not expected. Grace Mitchell has not only demonstrated exemplary academic integrity, Andrew said, she has transformed our entire approach to educational technology. Her ideas are original, her methods are ethical, and her impact is measurable. He turned to look directly at Benjamin. Professor Cole, with all due respect, it seems your objection is not with Grace's conduct, but with the fact that an undergraduate student developed solutions the academic field did not. The room erupted. Applause echoed from every corner, students stood, and Grace saw tears in the eyes of some professors. Emma was clapping so enthusiastically she looked as if she might take flight. Benjamin Cole looked as if the world had collapsed around him. His arrogant expression had been replaced with something that looked dangerously close to public humiliation. Order! Order! Dean Morrison shouted, though he was smiling. When the noise finally settled, Grace turned to the audience. I would like to make one thing clear, she said, her voice emotional but firm. I am not here to attack anyone. I am here to defend the right of students to use their education to make a difference in the real world. She looked at Benjamin, then at the audience. Harvard taught me to think critically, to research thoroughly, and to never accept the status quo when I can improve it. If that is misconduct, then I am proud to be guilty. The room erupted again, this time with applause that lasted a full 5 minutes. Grace felt tears run down her face, but they were tears of relief and victory. When she looked at Andrew, he was smiling with such obvious pride that it made her heart race. And in the middle of the celebratory chaos, Grace realized that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going right. Grace had always thought Boston's winter had a personality of its own. Usually the personality of a grumpy neighbor who threw ice in your face without warning. But that December afternoon, 3 weeks after her epic victory at the Harvard Faculty Club, even the icy cold seemed to be on her side. Harvard Yard was covered with a perfect layer of snow, turning the campus into something that looked like it belonged on a postcard that cost $40 in the gift shop. Students hurried between buildings like late penguins, wrapped in coats that made them look like colorful marshmallows with legs. Grace was sitting on a bench near the John Harvard statue, watching Emma build an army of snowmen with the determination of a general planning world domination. Her daughter had decided that each snowman needed a unique personality, which apparently required using sticks, stones, and occasionally found trash to create artistic expressions. "Mom, this is Professor Snowman," Emma announced, pointing to a creation that looked like it had been hit by a tornado. "He teaches about how not to be boring." "Very educational," Grace agreed, taking a sip of the coffee she had bought to stay alive in the Arctic cold. "And that one? That is the CEO Snowman. He wears a stick tie and promises things he later forgets." Grace almost spit out her coffee. "Emma, where did you learn about CEOs who forget promises?" "On TV," Emma replied innocently, "and by listening to you talk to yourself in the kitchen." Sometimes Grace wondered if she should consider a career in sports commentary, since apparently Emma was documenting her entire emotional life as if it were a reality show. "Grace?" She turned, and there was Andrew, appearing through the snowfall like a character from a romantic movie. He wore a dark wool coat that made him look even taller, and snowflakes clung to his hair, perfectly tousled by the wind. "Andrew," Grace said, feeling that familiar rush in her chest. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," he answered honestly, stepping closer to the bench. "Sarah Chen told me you often come here with Emma in the afternoons." "Sarah has a very big mouth," Grace murmured, but she was smiling. "May I sit?" Grace motioned to the space beside her on the bench, trying to ignore the fact that Andrew's sitting so close did strange things to her ability to form coherent thoughts. "How are you?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "Surviving Boston winter and motherhood at the same time," Grace replied. "You know, the usual." Emma looked over and waved enthusiastically. "Hi, Soup Man. Did you come to see my snowmen with personalities?" "Soup Man," Andrew repeated, raising an eyebrow. "She promoted you from boring man in a suit," Grace explained. "It is practically a Nobel Prize in Emma terms." Andrew laughed, that real laugh that reminded Grace why she had fallen for him in the first place. "I will accept the promotion with honor." They remained in silence for a few minutes, watching Emma add more architectural details to her snowmen. The silence was not uncomfortable, but there was an underlying tension, as if both were waiting for the other to start an important conversation. "Grace," Andrew finally said, "I need to apologize." "For what?" Grace asked, though she suspected the answer. "For doubting you. For not defending you when I should have. For letting Benjamin almost destroy your career while I stood there like a coward." Grace took another sip of coffee, considering her reply. "You redeemed yourself publicly at the faculty club. It was quite dramatic, actually. Sarah said some professors are still talking about it." "It should not have needed to reach that point," Andrew insisted. "I should have trusted you from the start." Grace studied him for a moment. There was something vulnerable in his expression, a sincerity she had not seen before. "Andrew," she said gently, "you are the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. You are used to calculating risks, weighing evidence, protecting your interests. I cannot blame you for being cautious. But I can blame myself for being a coward." Grace smiled, not the sarcastic smile she often used, but something softer. "Do not worry. I am used to men who keep coffee warm and promises cold." Andrew looked at her for a second, processing the joke, then burst into laughter. "That was harsh, but accurate," Grace added. "Although, to be fair, you never actually promised me anything. I was the one who assumed things." "What kind of things?" Grace felt the heat rise up her neck. "Nothing important." "Grace." "Fine. Maybe I thought there was something more between us. Beyond work, I mean." Andrew turned on the bench to face her fully. "There was." "There is." "Andrew." "No, let me speak," he said, his voice growing more intense. "These last few weeks without you on the project have been miserable. Not only professionally, although your absence has been a huge loss for the team. Personally, I missed you. I missed your sarcastic jokes, the way you made meetings more interesting, how you saw solutions where the rest of us saw only problems. Grace felt butterflies doing Olympic acrobatics in her stomach. Go on. I missed you questioning everything I said, making me be better, smarter, more human. Human is good, Grace admitted. Robot CEO was getting a bit dull. Andrew smiled. See, that is exactly what I missed. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Grace had the feeling they were about to cross a line they would not be able to undo. Andrew, she said hesitantly, I have a daughter, 2 college degrees to pay for, and a tendency to spill coffee at important moments. You have a company to run, a board to impress, and you probably do not need the complication that is my life. What if I want the complication? Then you are braver than I thought. Andrew leaned closer, or more in love than I thought. Grace felt the world stop for a second. In love? Completely, Andrew admitted. Hopelessly, since that first day when you almost spilled coffee on me and gave me the best life lesson I ever received. About hot coffee? About authenticity. About being real. About not accepting less than you deserve. Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. Andrew? Mom, Soup Man. Emma shouted from her snowman building area. Are you having a romantic moment? Because I can go build snowmen farther away if you want to kiss. Grace covered her face with her hands, mortified. Emma? What? On TV, when people look at each other like that, they always kiss after. Andrew laughed until his eyes watered. She has a point. She does? About us kissing, Andrew said, his voice becoming more serious. I would very much like to kiss you right now, Grace Mitchell. Grace looked at him, really looked. She saw the man who had stood up publicly to defend her, who had admitted his mistakes, who had chosen her over his own convenience. Then kiss me, she said simply. Andrew did not need to be asked twice. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers, gentle but certain. The kiss tasted like coffee and promises, like snow and second chances. When they pulled away, Grace was smiling. That was better than hot coffee, she murmured. Better than hot coffee is high praise coming from you. Do not get used to it. Coffee is still priority number 1. Andrew laughed and pulled her closer. I can live with second place. Finally, Emma shouted from a distance. Now I can stop pretending I was not listening to everything. Grace and Andrew looked at each other and began to laugh. Laughter that mixed with the snowflakes and the promises of something new and wonderful beginning. 6 months later, Grace Mitchell stood on the stage of the Boston Convention Center, looking at an audience of 500 people, wondering how on earth her life had turned into a fairy tale that even Emma would find exaggerated. The launch event for the EduTech Social Initiative was bigger than anything Grace had imagined. Mayors from 3 cities, representatives from the Department of Education, reporters from TechCrunch, and even a Channel 5 news crew were documenting what the media had called the revolution of accessible education. Grace adjusted the microphone and smiled at the audience, trying not to laugh at the fact that she was wearing a dress that cost more than her former rent, a gift from Andrew, who had insisted that co-founders of social initiatives must look professional. She had agreed, but only under the condition that she could wear her favorite Converse sneakers underneath. Ladies and gentlemen, Grace began, her voice echoing through the auditorium. 7 months ago, I was just a single mother trying not to spill coffee on important CEOs. Today, I am here to present a platform that will bring quality education to more than 100,000 children in underserved communities. The audience applauded, but Grace noticed Emma in the front row making dramatic gestures for her to speak louder. Her daughter was dressed as a junior executive consultant, a title she had created for herself, complete with a pink blazer and a toy briefcase where she kept her important ideas. The EduTech Social Initiative was born from a simple idea, Grace continued, that educational technology should be smart enough to adapt to the realities of the families it serves, not the other way around. From the side of the stage, Andrew watched with the kind of proud smile usually reserved for parents watching school performances. In recent months, he had become something Grace never expected. A real partner. Not only at work, but in life. He had learned to make star-shaped pancakes for Emma, had survived 3 parent-teacher meetings, and had shown an impressive ability to assemble IKEA furniture without a nervous breakdown. But this initiative is not only about technology, Grace said, clicking to the next slide. It is about recognizing that the best solutions come from people who truly live the problems we are trying to solve. She spotted Benjamin Cole in the audience, sitting in the back and looking as if he had swallowed something particularly sour. After the debacle at the faculty club, he had been transferred to an administrative role where his ability to cause trouble was severely limited. Grace had sent him an invitation to the event, not out of spite, but because she believed in second chances. Even for professors with superiority complexes. "I would like to share a few numbers with you," Grace said, her energy lifting. "In the past 6 months, our platform has been implemented in 47 public schools. 89% of students improved their math grades. 94% reported greater engagement with the material. And, my favorite statistic, 100% of teachers said the platform made them feel more effective in their classrooms." The applause was enthusiastic. Grace saw tears in the eyes of several teachers in the audience. "But statistics do not tell the full story," Grace continued. "Let me introduce someone who can." Emma practically jumped onto the stage, carrying her toy briefcase with the seriousness of a lawyer presenting crucial evidence. "Hello, everyone," Emma said into the microphone, causing immediate laughter from the audience. "I am Emma Mitchell, Junior Executive Consultant and Mom's official daughter." Grace bent down to adjust the microphone to Emma's height. "Tell them about our field research, Dr. Mitchell." "Well," Emma said, opening her briefcase with exaggerated importance, "I tested the platform at my school, and I can confirm that it makes math less boring. I also tested if it still works when you spill apple juice on the tablet. Spoiler alert, it does." The audience laughed loudly, and Grace saw Andrew at the side of the stage laughing until he had tears in his eyes. "And also," Emma continued, clearly enjoying the attention, "the platform is approved by children who have moms who drink a lot of coffee and sometimes cry watching dog commercials." "Emma?" Grace whispered, mortified. "What? It is qualitative research?" Andrew chose that moment to join them on stage, carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and 1 hot chocolate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, taking the microphone, "allow me to introduce the official tradition of the EduTech Social Initiative." He handed 1 coffee to Grace, another to himself, and the hot chocolate to Emma. "A few months ago," Andrew continued, "Grace taught me that hot coffee is more than a drink. It is a symbol of persistence, of keeping yourself going even when everything feels impossible." Grace felt emotion rise in her chest as she understood where he was going with this. "So today, at the official launch of this initiative, I would like to offer a toast," Andrew said, raising his cup. "As long as the coffee is hot, we are still alive. And as long as we are alive, we will keep fighting to make education accessible for every child who deserves a chance to dream big." The audience erupted into applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Grace felt tears stream down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude for how her life had changed. "Mom, you are crying again," Emma whispered, but she was smiling. "They are happy tears, sweetheart." "I know, those are the best kind." Andrew leaned in and kissed Grace softly, causing even more applause and a few whistles from the audience. "So," he murmured against her lips, "what do you think? Did we manage to change the world?" Grace looked at the cheering audience, at Emma taking dramatic bows, at the posters showing all the schools that would benefit from the initiative. "I think we managed to start," she replied. "And sometimes starting is the hardest part." "And now?" Grace smiled, the smile that had captured Andrew's heart from the first day. "Now we drink our coffee while it is hot and stay alive long enough to see what else we can accomplish." Andrew laughed and pulled her closer. "I love when you talk like that." "Like what?" "As if anything were possible." Grace looked around once more, at the audience, at Emma, at the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. "With hot coffee and the right people by your side," she said, "anything truly is possible." And in the middle of the continuous applause, while Emma began an improvised autograph session with her qualitative research, Grace Mitchell realized that sometimes happy endings come disguised as new beginnings. and that no matter what the future held, as long as the coffee was hot and Andrew was by her side, she was ready for anything, even to be happy. And what about you? Have you ever experienced a situation where a small accident completely changed the course of your life? Share with us in the comments what your spilled coffee moment brought something unexpected. Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive more heartfelt stories like this one. See you next time.